So now let's talk about some specific minimalist artists. And we're going to start off with who I think is sort of considered the father of minimalism, Donald Judd. And Donald Judd starts out his career really thinking about this idea of the form being what guides minimalist sculpture. One thing I'll point out right away, notice that his works are untitled because if you don't really have a proper subject, how do you really title these works, right? So, just like with Pollock, who would, number the works, things such as that to title them, right? Here, Judd's like untitled. I'm a contemporary art historian, and this is the kind of work I've done most of my career, sort of, built my career on. And you usually have to refer to these works by date. So untitled like 1970, untitled 1972, and then sometimes even month and specific date, because there might be multiple works created within a year. So sometimes, dealing with these as far as identifying them can be rather difficult to say the least. But the point that Judd is making is that, well, what do you want me to call them? Iron box, plexiglass, forms, what do you call these things? So he's like untitled, I'm not going to bother with that. And notice the focus of these, of course, is the idea of what sculpture is known for, which is form, mass, right? And one of them is an iron box. The other is these plexiglass pieces that almost look like shelves, right, running up a wall. The form is what's essential, right, not subject matter. Judd took great pains to collect his work and give it a space to live in a sense. So as he became more prominent as an artist, he started to think about, I want my art to be in a place where people can see it, see a lot of it at one time. I want them to have a sort of mediated experience, right, of how to view these things. I want to have a lot of control, right, over how people interact with my art. And so he actually bought a plot of land in Marfa, Texas. The land actually was an abandoned army barracks that had been used during World War II. And Marfa, Texas is in southwest Texas, right? And it's in a very remote area near to the border with Mexico. And so there's not a lot of people out here. A lot of it's just, farmland and grazing land, very desolate, type of place. So he bought up this army barracks and then started to convert a lot of the structures to show his artwork in. And then also you'll notice he put artworks throughout the landscape as well. So here are some of his concrete works, right? And my friends and I actually went out there when I was doing my master's degree to see, right, the complex, right, to sort of see this place in person. And Marfa has basically like a big, I guess it's like a conference kind of sort of. A big event I believe it's October. Every October they have it, and it's really a cool thing to go see at least once because everyone in the art world goes there. So I remember going here when I was doing my master's degree. I believe I was like 22, 23, somewhere in that range, and in sort of being like sitting next to these luminaries, like from the art world, all these critics and authors and people that I knew their names, right? I read their work, but I'm like, oh my god, are you really so and so? It was kind of cool. So if you ever get a chance to go out to Marfa for the festival, it's a pretty cool experience. So you'll note that he, sort of sprinkles his work along the landscape, and then he also creates these spaces in the old army barracks, right, to show his works as well. And he plays with, again, the idea of form, repeating forms, right, over and over and over again, using unusual materials like concrete, right, and steel, right, as sort of the platform. This is Eva Hesse, right? I had mentioned her work briefly before when we talked about the fiberglass. And one of the things I want to note with minimalists is like they don't do the same kind of stuff, right? You would think that there'd be a certain kind of limitation because of the idea of no subject matter and just working from what sculpture could be. But I actually find there's a lot of variety in minimalism. So where like Judd, he uses these very industrial materials like steel, concrete. Hesse uses unusual materials like string, like you see here, right? Or like the fiberglass we saw in the other work. This is one of her earliest works that she did that she really did as she put it, to challenge the idea of what we hang on a gallery wall. But you'll notice that the frame is empty, and then the hanging part is sort of jutting out into your physical space. So I got to see this when I went to Chicago and went to the museum there. And so she really like thinks about how we look at these pieces and interact with these pieces. This is expanded expansion. She used a fiberglass mixture here. Now it's so brittle that the Whitney, who owns the piece, actually can't even display it any longer because they know if they try to move it, it'll probably crack and disintegrate off the rods, right? So sometimes using unusual materials doesn't always help you out. It often creates problems with your art. So she would use these unusual materials, right, in her pieces to create these works. Unfortunately, the fiberglass that she used, we know now, of course, it can cause cancer. She actually developed brain tumors, and that was the cause of her death. So when we tell artists, make sure you're using safety precautions when you're using materials. Make sure your spaces are ventilated. This is the kind of stuff we're thinking about because often your materials can be toxic. But again, Hesse to me, she creates more of a biomorphic, like almost a living idea of art, where Judd's to me looks very industrial, very fabricated. Then you get to Linda Bengley's, and she does what we call pour pieces, where she uses liquid latex and she actually pours the liquid latex, this plastic, right? This plastic material. She would pour this stuff in galleries and create these flows, right? Again, notice that each artist I'm showing you is really using a very different approach to minimalism, and really thinking about the idea of process and shape and form very, very differently. So she did a lot of these works using, again, another type of unusual material, which was like this poured latex. And here's one of her sculptures that she started to do kind of midway through her career. It looked like these kind of biomorphic masses. They look kind of like, like they're alive, but you don't know what it is, right? Kind of alien and grotesque. And then there's Dan Flavin. And Flavin, he's really cool. He uses the concept of light. Like, how can you use light as a sculptural material? So here you see his show at the Guggenheim, his retrospective at the Guggenheim, where he literally lit up the outside of the snail shell of the building, right, with these different lights, right? But yeah, he starts off his career thinking about how can you use fluorescent tubing, right, as a sculpture material. And this is really fascinating to me because, again, it's another industrial kind of material, but it's the kind of thing that anyone could walk into like a Home Depot and buy. So the idea of access to materials and how materials can be used, he's really challenged you to think differently about materials, and who can use them and who can access them. But he would make these amazing sculptures, right, with the light tubes. On the right, you have his Guggenheim show again, so you can see how he lit up different floors with different lighting effects, and then had these fluorescent tubes going down through the center of the atrium. He has some installations at Marfa. So the Marfa collectors or curators, they always try to add in new works every year to the Marfa collection. And so the year that I went to Marfa, they had actually just recently purchased the Dan Flavins, so I got to see these pieces in person. So as you walk towards them, there, it's like kind of like looks like you can go in these rooms. There's like these light effects that kind of are illusionistic, right? That you're like, can I go in there? Can I not go in there? What am I really, really seeing here? And I wanted to finish off talking about minimalism by talking about the problems inherent within it. And this is Richard Serra's Tilted Arc, very, very famous piece. It was created for the Federal Plaza in New York City. The Federal Plaza was outside a group of office buildings. So just office workers worked up in these buildings and they'd look down into the square. And this is what was created for the square. It's this big, giant iron wall, in a sense, right, that ran across the Federal Plaza. And why I say this shows you the problems of minimalism is because when it was put up, people hated it. They were like, "What the heck is this thing?" And the government was like, "Well, it's sculpture. It's commissioned sculpture." And they were like, "No, no, 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 no. That's not sculpture." So I always joke that when you look at public sculpture, especially, you got to be careful about what you commission because people are very picky, right? If they don't know it and don't understand it, then you often react very violently to it. right? Because again, they don't care about theory or why these people are doing what they're doing. They're just like, this thing's ugly and it's in my way, right? What is it? So the workers of the buildings around the plaza were just like, "What in the heck is this ugly ass sculpture?" I hate this thing. It cut off their route through the square where they had to go then around it. Everything about it just made them angry, and so they actually brought suit against the city of New York, right, and against Richard Serra to have the piece removed. And here you see it after it had aged quite a bit right before it was about to be removed. And their suit was that they hated it, it was ugly, and it needed to be gone. It didn't help, anything aesthetically. It was just this eyesore, right, essentially. And they told Richard Serra in the suit proceedings, like, look, just take it down and you can go put it somewhere else, but we hate it and we want it gone. And Richard Serra argued it is site specific. So what does this mean? It's specific to the place that it's in. It's site specific. And this is something a lot of minimalists and earthworks that we're going to look at later, earthworks artists will believe, is that you create something for a site specific context. It exists in that site specific context. And so you can't move it, you can't alter it. It would become a completely different sculpture. It has to be living where it's living. Unfortunately, Richard Serra lost the case, and so the tilted arc actually was removed right before the whole demolishing of this whole area was going to take place anyway. So it's sort of a Pyrrhic victory, as we say. Um, but again, it proved a point about people's interaction with minimalism, and I still see this to this day. We have some public art on the TCC campus, and a couple minimalist pieces, and people tend to give them the side eye, or when we wanted to buy them we got a lot of pushback from the foundation and other people were asking for money to acquire them, because people, again, they think of sculpture and they think of the traditional role of sculpture. They don't think of this stuff as being valid. But I always say don't cry for Richard Serra because his career exploded out of this. I always say controversy can be good for a lot of things. So many people think that he kind of allowed for the controversial court case to go on because he was like, "That's just exposure for me. That's media I can use." He had learned Andy Warhol's lesson, right? Use your 15 minutes of fame. And so now Richard Serra is a very, very famous minimalist who does a lot of works out of iron. Here you see some of his works in a museum collection. Again, you can see them in many different public parks and in different outdoor areas. So I always joke, don't cry for Richard Serra. He's made quite a career out of minimalism in using minimalist sculpture.